You're not nearly as tall as Jeff is.
No, I'm not. Although sometimes I wish I was.
I know,
How's it cool that you get a cup holder and I don't?
because I'm cool.
Well, that's true. That's true.
So, have you ever been in a situation where you advocated for a desired outcome, even though things rightfully would have turned out differently? Today we're going to learn about the Sanhedrin and their misguided ways.
The Sanhedrin's complicated. So the Sanhedrin was the highest legislative body in Jewish Palestine. So it was the supreme judicial court and the grand jury for important cases. So in Jewish law, the buck stopped here. So the Sanhedrin was made up of Jewish leaders, including the high priest and the elders. It also had the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes. And the high priest presided over the whole Jewish court. Now, the Sanhedrin they were engaged in the labor of studying the Jewish law and how it applied to the authority in Jewish life. And they also tried capital cases. And at the time of Jesus, New Testament writers testified that the Jewish court, was an opponent of Jesus and his movement. So this council was to keep order and administer punishment, and was the political link to the Roman governor Pilate. Now, Pilate was swift to administer punishment for any perceived challenge to his authority. And there was no love lost between Pilate, Rome's highest representative, Pilate, and the nation he was expected to keep in line.
Yeah, he was quite a tyrant.
Sounds like it.
So let us think for a minute. What are the essential elements of a fair trial? And how can power be used to manipulate and control others? You know, in the United States, we talk about due process. There was none of that here.
So Jesus had actually been on the Sanhedrin's radar for some time. But events had brought him close to Jerusalem recently, and the Jewish people didn't like it. The Jewish leaders, really, they didn't like it. They were threatened. So if you recall, Jesus had just recently raised Lazarus from the dead at a village just outside of Jerusalem's walls. And he had won many new followers after this miracle, which sort of heightened the perceived threat. Okay? So some who witnessed this resurrection, they, though, immediately went and reported to the Sanhedrin, again, the Jewish leaders, and they called a meeting, and they felt it was time to make a decision on what to do about this Jesus character, right? And their concern was, if Jesus gathered too many followers, he might gain the attention of the Roman authorities and upset the balance of power between the Romans and the Jews, hurting the Jewish cause. Okay? So, what do? The official decision was that Jesus must die.
Jesus must die. The religious leaders feared Jesus' growing influence. They perceived him as a threat to their established authority. Their decision was driven by a desire to protect their positions and maintain their control. So, my question is, do we ever let our desire to control a situation prompt us to sacrifice our integrity? I want this to come out a certain way, and I'll do whatever I have to do to make that happen. Have we ever stayed in a bad circumstance because we know what to expect in that circumstance? And we have a fear of the unknown. You know, the monster that we know is more easily handled than the monster that we do not know, even if it's uncomfortable.
So the Sanhedrin had to start the process of killing Jesus. They had to start with a Jewish trial. Okay? Now, they did not have the authority to execute someone. They needed the Roman governor for that particular verdict. But first came the Jewish trial. And so according to Jewish law, they needed the testimony of 2 witnesses. But they didn't have 2 witnesses, so they set out to find them. So they had made a contract with Judas to betray Jesus. Remember the 30 pieces of silver? We talked about that. So they made that contract with Judas to betray Jesus, and they arrested Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? And they hauled him into court immediately. But all of the false witnesses that they had gathered up, they couldn't come up with corroborating stories. And so they finally swore Jesus in to testify. And when the high priest put Jesus under oath, he had to reply. And he testified clearly that he was the Son of God. And this resulted in a charge of blasphemy, a heretical claim. Now, the whole process, it was really handled in a very irregular fashion. Obviously, hey, let's coach some witnesses and get them to say what we want them to say. Obviously, that didn't work because they couldn't come up with the same thing. So all of that testimony was rendered invalid and they couldn't use it. But the trial sort of took place kind of overnight and like vigilante style. And they waited to give the verdict in the morning because it was actually a breach of Jewish protocol to prosecute capital cases overnight. Sneaky.
Very sneaky. So how did the irregularities of Jesus' trial undermine the principles of justice? In what situations do we prioritize self-preservation over ethical principles? How easily can truth be manipulated to fit a desired outcome? How can you and I pursue truth in a world where information is often distorted? And boy, we see a lot of that.
Sounds familiar to me.
In today's news.
Yeah.
The Sanhedrin, the highest Jewish court, misused its power. They sought false testimony, and they manipulated the legal process to condemn Jesus. This demonstrates how those in positions of authority can pervert justice to serve their own agendas.
That never happens today, does it? So in the case of Jesus, and in many similar other cases, the Sanhedrin exercised their authority with the assistance then of the Roman government by neutralizing a troublesome teacher and a threat to public order. So Jesus' trial actually took place in 6 parts. Okay, number 1, immediately upon his arrest, Jesus was brought in front of Annas. Now, Annas was the former high priest, and he was still kind of a major power broker in Jerusalem. And Annas took him to Caiaphas, who was the current high priest. And he maintained that the charges against him warranted a full trial. right? So the Jewish leaders are like, how are we going to get this guy in front of Caiaphas? Let's go to the old high priest, get his backing, and then take him to the current one. Does that make sense? So then Jesus was presented to the full council to hear the witness testimony against him and to question Jesus himself. And remember, that kind of all went bad because none of the witnesses could corroborate their story. But frankly, truth be told, the decision honestly was already made, before any testimony was given, right? The backroom decisions was already made. Now, the third part of the trial, though, was the sentencing. And remember, they didn't do all that stuff at night. Their process was not to do the sentencing at night. Their process was always to do the sentencing in the morning. So they have this kind of, backyard meeting. We're gonna, say that Jesus is wrong. We're gonna give our sentencing. That kind of happened quickly overnight. Not a whole lot of witnesses, with the exception of the Jewish, high council. And so then the next morning, the verdict was given. And the morning sentencing was really an attempt to sort of give some legitimacy to what happened overnight, right? And then the next three portions of the trial took place under the Roman jurisdiction, because remember, Jerusalem was under Roman rule. And so remember, they first went to Pilate, and then Pilate said, no, go to Herod. And Herod's like, go back to Pilate. But we'll go more into the in-depth in that process. That's a topic for next week. So we'll go into more of that next week.
So how do our own preconceived notions influence how we interpret events and people? As Chrissy explained to us, Jesus was found guilty before he ever entered a courtroom. How can we recognize and challenge our own biases to ensure that we are acting justly and to require that our leaders are acting justly? How does fear influence decision making, both individually and collectively? When have you been afraid to do the right thing because you knew it would cost you personally? And I'm not just talking about your wallet. I'm talking about your image. I'm talking about your options. We sometimes back away from the right thing because we know there's a personal cost to it.
So at the cross, Jesus is on the cross. If you remember correctly, there were all kinds of people like just making fun of him, jeering at him, etc. And members of the Jewish Sanhedrin were present as well. And they joined in on the jeering and attacking. And they said to him, look, you said you would rebuild the temple in 3 days. If you can do that, then you can come down from that cross and prove to us that you're God's son. And they also said, he saved others. Why can't he save himself? They requested a Roman guard be placed outside of Jesus' tomb, believing that the Jews would try to remove Jesus' body. Jesus' disciples lived in fear of the Jewish leaders in the immediate days following Jesus' death, afraid that they would fall to the same fate that killed Jesus. I bet they were terrified.
Mm-hmm. So how does understanding the historical and political context of events enhance our interpretation of them? We've read this Passion and Easter story so many times, yet there's a lot of background nuance that really colors the entire story. The religious leaders feared Jesus' growing influence. They perceived him as a threat to their established but tenuous authority. And we're going to hear a little bit more about that next week, about these dynamics between the Jewish leaders and the Roman rule. So they perceived Jesus as this threat to their established authority, and their actions were driven by a desire to protect their positions and maintain their control, highlighting how fear can corrupt decision making. Now, we view this story in the context of the outcome. We know the entire story. The Sanhedrin ultimately served the purpose of God's plan of salvation. But I've got a question I want you to consider. Just because they fulfilled God's purpose and plan of salvation, does that exempt them from judgment for the actions that they took? What do you think? You know, the truth is we all betray Jesus in the service of self-interest in big and small ways, and we are all in need of God's mercy. Sometimes I keep my mouth shut when I ought to be giving testimony to my faith. And sometimes I open my mouth and what comes out, people who hear it would never know I am a person of faith. We betray Jesus in big and small ways. Now, next week, we are going to be learning about the Roman part of Jesus' trial. How would you have liked to have been Pontius Pilate that particular day? Connie and Kaylee are going to share that message with us next week. I'm sure they will appreciate your prayers. Amen. Thank you.
You're welcome.